Hello Year 10. The poems that we're going to look at today then are Remains by Simon Armitage and War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. We should all be familiar with the assessment objectives by this point. So assessment objective 1 is being able to understand the poems and use textual references or quotations. Assessment objective 2 is your ability to analyse the poetic methods used, which include language, structure, form, imagery and sound devices. And assessment objective 3 is being able to understand the relationship between the poems and their context, whether that's the history surrounding them or the social or political matters. The big question that we're going to bear in mind whilst analysing these poems is how are mental health and emotions presented in Remains and War Photographer? So while we're answering that question, we're going to revise the two poems, we're going to consider the two poems in comparison to one another, and we're going to analyse all of those methods for assessment objective 2, particularly structure and sound for those pupils going for the higher grades. So if we start by looking at the poem Remains by Simon Armitage, the title itself is really quite significant to analyse. So it can be interpreted in 3 different ways. Firstly, it refers to the physical remains of the looter's body, who the soldier has shot. Secondly, it can refer to what the soldier sees as the remains of his own life, having shot the looter and feeling that guilt. So he feels like his own life is in tatters. And thirdly, it can refer to the memories, the flashbacks and the nightmares that the soldier's been having as a result of this shooting. Now, we more commonly know that experience as post-traumatic stress disorder. So for AO3, you might want to talk about how post-traumatic stress disorder is recognised as a mental illness nowadays. However, it's still not treated as effectively as it might be, and we can see that in the poem from the soldier's use of drink and drugs, which are mentioned in there. So he tries to self-medicate to try and get rid of that traumatic memory. Now, back in World War I and World War II, there wasn't even any recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder as a proper illness. We hear about shell shock in World War I, but yet again it wasn't really treated as a serious condition. If you wanted to link this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder to another quotation within the poem, the soldier does actually talk about how the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. Now, that's a metaphor because not only does it reinforce that lots of military ex-servicemen have drug and alcohol problems, more so than other civilians, as a result of their experiences, but it also suggests that the soldier needs to rid himself of this disease, this virus that's infecting his system. So he feels that the memory, the traumatic memory, is something that he needs to flush out of his system in the same way that you would flush a disease or a virus out of your body. And he's trying to do that with the alcohol, but unfortunately it's not successful. So if we start off by looking at some of the words that Armitage uses in his poem, the soldier recounting the events uses phrases like "Legsit," "mates," "letting fly" and "I swear." Now these are all colloquialisms or slang words and phrases, and they're used to reflect the fact that Armitage interviewed real ex-military servicemen, and he wanted to use their language to add realism and authenticity to their voices and their stories. Using colloquial language makes the event seem more poignant, more touching, because this is how the soldier would actually say it spontaneously. If Armitage would have used formal standard English at all times in the poem, it would have taken away some of that natural emotion and it would have sounded quite artificial and contrived. So using this colloquial language allows the reader to empathise more with the soldier because he seems to be just like one of us. So he's humanised through that use of colloquial language, and therefore we feel his anguish even more. If you want to know a little bit more about Assessment Objective 3 and the origin of this poem, Armitage actually interviewed a selection of ex-military servicemen and then created a collection of poems called The Not Dead. And these poems document first-hand accounts of ex-military servicemen. This particular poem, Remains, is taken from the account of a soldier from West Bromwich who fought in the Gulf War during the 1990s, so therefore it's based on true events. Moving on to the imagery used in the poem, Armitage, or the soldier, tells us that the looter's blood shadow stays on the street. So Armitage uses a metaphor here to suggest that, like a shadow which follows you everywhere you go, the soldier can't escape that guilt and that memory of shooting the man, no matter how much he tries to run away from it or drown it out with alcohol. You might also link that image to the line later in the poem where he says, "He's here in my head when I close my eyes," because it seems that no matter what the soldier tries to do to erase that memory, he can't escape the guilt of the murder. So this just proves that he's having lots of nightmares and flashbacks that are a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. Not only this, but his guilt is intensified by the fact that he acknowledges that the looter was probably armed, possibly not. So he realises that he should have established for definite whether the man was armed or not before fatally injuring him. It's almost like the soldier has become too ready to fire, like a trained killing machine. And that perhaps explains why the soldiers are referred to as all of the same mind, and that's a quotation from the poem. So it suggests that they've all been indoctrinated and brainwashed to kill on instinct. We also know that this isn't the only traumatic event that the soldiers experienced, because he actually begins the narrative, it's a narrative poem, which tells us this story. He begins it with "on another occasion," implying that he's had numerous traumatic experiences like this one. But it seems that this one sticks in his head because it wasn't a shooting on the battlefield where in some ways he would feel justified, but it's the shooting of a comparatively innocent man. Moving on to structure. An interesting point that you might make about this poem is when he tells us, "End of story, except not really." Now, Armitage uses an interesting choice of punctuation after "end of story." The phrase itself would imply that that should be followed by a full stop, whereas Armitage chooses to use a comma. Now that suggests that even though the public think that a soldier's problems should end as soon as he leaves the combat zone and as soon as he gets back home, that actually in reality their mental health problems persist indefinitely. They go on for a long time after leaving the war zone. Another feature structurally of the poem is the use of enjambment, which reinforces the idea that this poem is narrative. It's a story being told anecdotally, so it's natural, spontaneous speech. The use of enjambment also speeds up the pace of the poem and gives it dramatic impact. It reflects the soldier's increasing distress when he's telling us about these events. There's only one example of rhyme in the poem. The rest of the poem is irregular and unrhymed in its structure. The example of rhyme is when he tells us that he left the looter's body in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land and 6 feet under in desert sand. Now the use of rhyme there jars with the rest of the poem, and it stands out significantly. And it suggests that that memory of burying the looter's body in a very shallow grave is the memory that sticks with him. So that implies that the disrespect that they had to show towards the man's body, because they had to get rid of it quickly, is the memory that traumatises him the most. He feels most guilty about the way they treated the body afterwards. So it's also quite effective to talk about the tone of a poem. So if you look at the final line of the poem, his bloody life in my bloody hands, we can see that Armitage is using a metaphor here to show the soldier's frustration that he had the power to decide the looter's fate. So the looter's survival was dependent on that soldier's actions. So the soldier seems very angry that he's trusted with that responsibility of making life and death decisions in a split second. He feels like he doesn't deserve that responsibility anymore and that he's not equipped to make such important decisions. If you wanted to analyse some of the language within the quotation, you could look at the word bloody, that adjective. It's deliberately ambiguous, which means it can be interpreted in more than one way. So literally it makes reference to the volume of blood that he and the looter are covered in, which obviously reinforces that feeling of guilt that he has. But it can also be interpreted as a colloquial swear word, and it shows the soldier's frustration with himself and disgust that he actually shot the looter. If you wanted to talk even more about this image, you might talk about how it's reminiscent of Macbeth after the murder of King Duncan. So if you remember, Macbeth looks at his hands and says, "What hands are these?" And he looks at all of that blood in the same way that the soldier is here. Now that comparison implies that the soldier knows he should have been protecting the civilians, not killing them, in the same way that Macbeth knows his job was to protect and defend King Duncan, not kill him, not bear the knife himself. So if we were to summarise the key mental health and emotions points that Armitage seems to be making, we would perhaps say that mental health issues need acknowledging as serious conditions and they require treatment. They can't just be left. Guilt and regret can be all-consuming emotions and completely dominate your life. Soldiers and ex-soldiers' mental health needs recognition for being as important as their physical capacity. So if a soldier comes back from the war and they don't have any physical injuries, we shouldn't assume that they don't have any mental health consequences of their experiences. And finally, depression and post-traumatic stress disorder are life-debilitating conditions that prevent closure, and they prevent people being able to move on constructively with their lives. Some of the themes that Armitage seems to be addressing then would be post-traumatic stress disorder as a very real condition that needs attention, the effects of war and conflict on mental health as well as physical health, guilt and regret, and finally, soldiers becoming desensitized to murder in conflict situations. So the fact that the soldier shoots without hesitation. Okay, so as mentioned on previous PowerPoints, if you're aiming for a grade 7 or above, the examiners like you to analyse more sophisticated methods of language, structure and form. So one of the things that you might comment on in this poem is the use of present tense in "I see every round as it rips through his life." Now, the deliberate use of present tense there suggests that the soldier is replaying that situation of the shooting every day. He cannot escape that flashback, and we know that flashback is one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So he relives that experience daily. You might also talk about the use of a Volta in Then I'm home on leave, but I blink. So the full stop in the middle of that line should indicate, or does indicate, the transition from military life back to civilian life at home. Now that transition is actually very difficult and traumatic for soldiers. However, they're given very little emotional support from the army to make that transition. They're left to their own devices. So that Volta, that turning point, that full stop, where he leaves the military war zone and comes back home, again, people assume that it ends there, the experience, but we know from this poem that actually the suffering continues. And finally, you could talk about the irregular stanza and line lengths and suggest that that reflects the chaotic state of the ex-soldier's mind. He can't organise or control his thoughts rationally. So we'll now move on to War Photographer, written by Carol Ann Duffy. Now, the title seems straightforward and self-explanatory, but there are some things that you might need to know about the poem's origin. So this poem is based on a conversation that Duffy had with a close friend of hers who was a war photographer. It's quite an interesting perspective to choose because war photographers are often forgotten about in the respect that they also witness these heinous events of war, although everybody fails to remember the fact that they too might suffer with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result. So Duffy's poem seems to confirm that post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition that affects not only soldiers but other bystanders of war. So she chooses this voice for the poem because the war photographer is there to document events. He's not supposed to intervene, and he can't intervene. He's not got the skills to intervene. And that's the main cause of the photographer's distress, the fact that he's helpless and he just has to photograph these events, almost like a voyeur, someone that's profiting from it. With assessment objective 3, the reference in the poem to running children in a nightmare heat links to a famous image that was actually taken by a war photographer of a 9-year-old Vietnamese girl running naked through the streets after a napalm attack in 1972. So that image embodies the horrific consequences of war, and these are the types of images that are branded into the photographer's minds. So if we look at some of the words used by Carol Ann Duffy, she uses a pattern of nouns to suggest that the war photographer's daily working life is filled with misery and pain. So she uses words like suffering, agonies and cries. Now that makes it more obvious and more apparent as to why he's suffering with PTSD. If you wanted to analyse suffering as part of the longer quotation, spools of suffering set out in ordered rows, we can see that the photographer views suffering as an ongoing state of existence in the world because he's got so many reels of film which capture images of suffering. It seems that nobody's doing anything to stop that suffering despite these photographs. The fact that he sets out these reels of film in ordered rows shows that he's attempting to bring order to the chaos that he witnesses every day in these war zones. But we can see that his attempts are pointless, they're futile. They're going to have no impact on the horrific events going on in these war zones. What he is trying to do is he's trying to desperately regain control in his own chaotic life. So when he goes back to England, he tries to restore some order back into his life. If you wanted to talk even further about another one of these words, you could look at the pluralization of agonies from 100 agonies in black and white. And that further reinforces the idea that this pain and suffering is rife. There's so much of it all over the world. The only predictable thing about the photographer's unpredictable, chaotic job is that these things will continue to go on in the world. So he knows that he will always have a job as a war photographer because unfortunately wars will always continue. Agony itself is a much more intense and excruciating form of pain, and it suggests that it's prolonged suffering. Now, the cries of the man's wife, which are mentioned, suggest that the war photographer's flashbacks aren't only characterised by visual imagery that he sees in his mind, but also by these aural memories, these memories of sounds that he could hear. Okay, so if we move on to the imagery in the poem War Photographer, the photographer says that one of the photographs he's taken of a man suffering is like a half-formed ghost. So we can see that Duffy's using metaphor there to suggest firstly that the image of the dying man has a hazy outline as it develops, making it appear ghostly. And metaphorically it suggests that the man is on the brink of death. He's almost become a ghost. But finally, and perhaps the most important inference that we can make from this metaphor, is that the memory haunts the photographer like a ghost. Now, ghosts supposedly haunt those people with whom they've got unfinished business. So perhaps the photographer feels that he's being haunted as retribution almost, or revenge for his failure to help, because we know that he feels very guilty about that, about not intervening, but instead photographing that suffering. If you wanted to stretch it a little bit further, you could look at the use of present tense when describing that scene. So he tells us that a stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. Now, that use of present tense reinforces the idea that these memories are not confined to the past. They live on constantly in his head, replaying and traumatizing him. So that's very similar to the use of present tense in Remains with I see every round as it rips through his life. So not only is he surrounded by physical images on his walls of his work and the suffering, but his mind is also like a reel of film upon which these images are imprinted indelibly. They can't be erased. In the same way as in Remains, even when he closes his eyes, he can't get rid of that image of the looter's body. Again, if you wanted to go even further, if we think that the photographer's mind is like a reel of film, the line in the poem Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh suggests, through the use of caesura after each conflict location, that each of those places and each of those war zones are imprinted onto his mind like snapshots or Polaroid images. And yet again, they can't be erased, they can't be wiped away. There are some really nice things to say about the structure of this poem. So if we start by looking at the line, he has a job to do, which is followed by a caesura in the middle of that line. So Duffy uses that caesura to suggest that the photographer has to emotionally detach himself from the atrocities that he witnesses every day in his job. And that's because the caesura makes that a simple sentence, a simple statement of fact. So he accepts that it's just something that's got to be done. He can't let his emotions get in the way, and he has to become numb, and he accepts that that's part of his job, is that detachment from his emotions. Again, if you wanted to say more about that, you could talk about how when he says he has a job to do, that simple statement makes it sound almost like he felt compelled to do that job. It was his duty, almost as if God intended him to do that. The use of the word job instead of career is quite interesting because it implies that he gets no satisfaction from his work. So in the same way that a priest's job is to spread the gospel or God's word so that people can be instructed in Christian values, the photographer feels that his vocation in life, his duty, is to raise awareness through his photographs of all the suffering going on in the world, in the hope that eventually that might change people and inspire people to act differently and act with more love and compassion. That therefore explains why earlier in the poem he uses the simile as though this were a church and he a priest, or should I say Duffy uses that simile. So that comparison to him being a priest reinforces that idea that it was his God-given duty to take these photographs and inform the world. Again, if you wanted to look at other structural points, you could look at the use of regular stanza lengths and the regular rhyme scheme, and that reinforces what we said earlier about the fact that the photographer is desperate to restore some form of order to his chaotic life when he returns home to England. You could also argue that that use of rhyme implies that his job has become predictable and routine. One thing that he can guarantee is that there will always be suffering in the world and he'll always have a job because there are always going to be these horrific photographs to be taken. And that in itself is quite a depressing thought. So you could also perhaps mention that the 4 stanzas, which each consist of 6 lines, reflect the standard size of a photograph, which is 6 by 4 inches. Again, there are some brilliant things to say about the tone of this poem. So if we look at the final phrase, the final line in the poem, it's "they do not care." Now, Duffy and the photographer's disillusionment is presented through that monosyllabic statement. So all of the words only have one syllable. And that shows that the photographer feels the people of Britain are completely indifferent to the suffering of those in other countries. So he thinks that we just aren't concerned about it, that we're too selfish to be concerned. And that increases the despair and hopelessness that the photographer feels. Just before this final statement, the photographer has told us how the reader's eyeballs will prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers when they're looking at these photographs in the Sunday newspaper. Now that quotation there implies that these photographs will have an emotional effect on readers because their eyes will prick with tears, but not enough to interrupt our daily routines or prompt us to take any kind of constructive action, because we'll look at these pictures and then we'll carry on with our daily lives and have our afternoon beers. The verb prick reinforces that because a prick is a minor injury that's quickly recovered from. And when it's used to describe tears, it suggests that tears will spring to our eyes, but we are able to hold them back. So it's an emotion that we can control. It's almost like we've become numb to these pictures. And then Duffy further trivialises our lives in comparison to those in war zones by referring to the luxuries that we take for granted, so the beers. It's almost like we've become passive observers of suffering. And this explains why the photographer no longer affiliates himself with England, with Britain. And when he's in the aeroplane, we're told that he's staring at it impassively and unemotionally. And he calls it where he earns his living rather than home. So that just suggests that he's appalled by and ashamed of our lack of response to these photographs. It's almost like we've seen so much suffering that we too have become numb to it and we accept it as normal. And that's what frustrates the photographer so much. So if we summarise the key mental health and emotions points that seem to be raised by Duffy in her poem, These might include that post-traumatic stress disorder affects not only those directly involved in combat, so the soldiers, but also those bystanders who often get forgotten about and ignored. Secondly, she might be suggesting that frustration is a key emotion felt by these war zone reporters and photographers because they have to document suffering to inform the rest of the world, but they can't do anything to assist and help. Thirdly, she might be suggesting that the responsibility felt by these war zone reporters to use their work to initiate change, that can actually be quite burdensome for them, quite stressful, that obligation, that sense of duty, particularly if we don't respond. And finally, she might be suggesting that war zone reporters are simultaneously angry and disillusioned by the failure of the rest of the world to intervene and do anything to make changes. So it's quite an unfulfilling job at times. Therefore, the key themes that Duffy seems to be addressing are war and conflict, responsibility and helplessness, post-traumatic stress disorder, and fear and suffering. And hopefully you can see how it's a similar poem to Remains for some of those issues. Okay, so as usual, some comments that you might make if you're going for a grade 7 or above are linked to sound and extra quotations that you might analyse. So in the poem, we're told that solutions slop in trays. So Duffy uses sibilance here to imitate the sound of the developing fluid sloshing around in the tray as he develops the photograph. Now, enabling the reader to hear that sound for themselves draws us into the photographer's dark room, and it allows us to experience that anticipation and dread that he feels as the image develops, the traumatic image. Incidentally, you might also talk about the noun solutions because it's deliberately ambiguous. It's got more than one meaning. Literally, the solution here can refer to the developing fluid, but metaphorically, it also suggests that the only answers we need to conflict in the world can be found in these photographs. So if we really looked at them and emotionally engaged with them, we'd see how much suffering is being caused, and we'd all unite together and make sure that wars never happened ever again. We'd see that it was intolerable and we'd put an end to it immediately. But the problem is, we don't really look properly at these images anymore. We've become numb to them. So I've written up a brief paragraph in response to the question, how do poets present the effects of conflict in Remains and one other poem of your choice? Both Simon Armitage and Carol Ann Duffy present the effects of conflict, whether participating directly in it or witnessing it, as being devastating to mental health and well-being. In both poems, conflict is something that causes much misery and suffering, not only physically, but also emotionally, where the effects are often longer lasting, resulting in the condition of post-traumatic stress disorder. In Remains, for example, Armitage describes the soldier's trauma at having shot a looter by stating that his blood shadow stays on the street, where the metaphor implies that, like a shadow, the experience follows the soldier, never leaving him and causing him significant distress. Similarly, in War Photographer, Duffy describes the photographer's experience of watching a photograph of a dying man develop as akin to witnessing a half-formed ghost materialise. This metaphor implies that the death of the man haunts the photographer, and like a spirit with unfinished business, the photographer feels he has been targeted for haunting as a result of failure to assist the dying man in his time of need. Flashbacks, paranoia, and nightmares about traumatic experiences are common symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. But unfortunately, this mental health illness is not always afforded the medical recognition it deserves. However, in Remains, Armitage chooses to document the experiences of an ex-soldier, whereas in War Photographer, Duffy chooses to document a bystander's account of trauma. So hopefully you can see there how I've addressed the assessment objectives. So firstly, for AO1, I've got my quotations which are well selected, and I'm showing understanding that the poems are about trauma, both of them. So I'm drawing that comparison. Assessment objective 2, I've chosen a metaphor from each poem for analysis, and it's nice because these two metaphors do have something in common, ghosts and shadows, both of which follow people around. And then for assessment objective 3, I show understanding of what post-traumatic stress disorder is and how it's treated by the medical industry and some of the symptoms of it. If you look at the start of the second paragraph, I did then begin to pick out a contrast between the poems. So remember that you can make comparison points but also contrast points. Okay, so these top tips have been on each of the PowerPoints so far. I'll let you read through them in your own time, but if I was to draw out a couple of key things, I would say that remember you don't have to write an equal amount on each of the poems, and if you're going for those higher grades, try to say something meaningful about structure and sound if possible.